3 in the morning, an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side. The man who walked in didn't knock, because men like him never needed to. Knox Aldridge, a name that made the entire Chicago underworld hold its breath. The youngest boss in the Aldridge dynasty's history, a man who ruled an empire with a glance, never raised his voice, never repeated an order twice. But tonight, he brought no bodyguards, no weapons, no power, just a single question. In the far corner, a girl sat curled on the cold concrete floor, a torn backpack at her feet, eyes wide open, staring straight at him, not afraid, not surprised, as if she'd been waiting, or as if she was simply used to being found in places no one wanted to be. "Why did you leave?" Knox's voice wasn't angry, wasn't cold. For the first time in his life, his voice carried only one thing: exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from driving 4 hours across a city, through 11 locations, searching for a girl who shared none of his blood, none of his world, none of anything except a home that neither of them knew what to call. But this story doesn't begin in this warehouse. To understand why Knox Aldridge, a man who had never chased anyone, never needed anyone, never admitted he was afraid of losing anyone, sat down on a filthy concrete floor at 3 in the morning for a 21-year-old girl who owned nothing but an old handkerchief and a lifetime of broken pieces. We have to go back 6 months, back to a charity gala in downtown Chicago, back to the hallway, behind the kitchen, where everything began with an apron, folded neatly. Before we begin, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. If this one touches you, share it, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change someone's day. 6 months before the day Knox Aldridge sat on the cold concrete floor of that warehouse, he was a completely different man. Or more precisely, he wasn't a man at all. He was a machine. The 42nd floor of Aldridge Holdings Tower looked out over the entire Chicago skyline, and Knox's private conference room sat in the eastern corner, where morning light never entered because the curtains were always drawn tight. He didn't like light. Light made people comfortable, and Knox didn't want anyone sitting across from him to feel comfortable. That morning, the man seated opposite him was Raymond Voss, owner of a chain of pawn shops on the south side of the city. Raymond had owed the Aldridge family a large sum for 3 years. He'd been granted extensions twice. He'd made promises 3 times, and he hadn't paid once. Raymond sat in the leather chair with his hands clasped together. His fingers drained white from how tightly he held them. Sweat dotted his forehead, even though the room was cold enough that breath should have been visible. Knox didn't look at Raymond. He was reading a file, turning each page slowly, as if the man trembling in front of him were nothing more than an ornament on the table. 1 minute passed, then 2. Raymond opened his mouth 3 times and closed it again, until he couldn't stand it anymore. "Mr. Aldridge, I know I was wrong, but if you give me another 6 months, I swear." Knox turned another page without looking up. The silence returned, heavier than before. Raymond swallowed so hard, the sound echoed in the room. Then Knox closed the file, placed it on the table, and looked up. He looked at Raymond for exactly 3 seconds, without blinking, without expression, and then he spoke, his voice as light as if he were asking about the weather. "Raymond, do you know why I never give anyone a 3rd chance?" Raymond didn't answer. He couldn't even breathe enough to answer. "Because a 3rd chance means I was wrong twice before to trust you. And I don't like being wrong." Knox stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the door. When he passed Raymond, he paused for a single beat. He didn't turn his head. He only added one more sentence that Raymond would remember for the rest of his life, and then he walked away. Raymond remained seated for another 15 seconds before he could stand. When he stepped out, his face was as white as paper, and Perry Holt was already waiting in the hallway. Perry was tall, his hair cut short, his face carrying the look of a man who always knew something amusing that no one else noticed. He'd been Knox's friend since childhood, his right hand, the only person who dared to speak plainly to the boss without fearing the consequences. Perry watched Raymond stagger down the hall, then stepped into the conference room. You could have said it sooner instead of letting him nearly pass out. Knox stood by the window, pulling the curtain slightly aside to look down at the city. Fear is more precise than words. One day someone's going to endure your silence. That day hasn't come yet. Perry didn't argue, because he knew Knox was right. For 7 years, since the day Knox's father was assassinated by a rival after a deal collapsed, Knox Aldridge had turned himself into something no one could reach. At 30, He inherited a crumbling underground empire. At 37, he turned it into a fortress. Aldridge Holdings on paper was a real estate and financial corporation. Beneath that paper was a network the entire Chicago underworld knew about, but no one dared to name. Knox didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. He only had to sit there in silence and let the silence do the work for him. For 7 years, no one had broken through that wall. For 7 years, no one had seen anything behind his cold gray eyes except a deliberate emptiness. Perry knew more than most. He knew Knox kept an old photograph in his desk drawer. A picture of Knox at 5 years old holding his newborn baby sister, grinning wide, the little sister who died in an accident when she was only 5. That photograph was the only thing in this room that carried any trace of a human being. But Knox never spoke of it, and Perry never asked. 7 years building walls. 7 years living like a ghost in his own home. 7 years believing that loneliness was a fair price to make sure no one could ever take anything from him again. Until the day his mother decided to bring home a strange girl in the middle of the rain. That evening, the Peninsula Chicago blazed with light for its annual charity gala. Knox came out of obligation, not desire. The Aldridge family donated a large sum to the Children's Fund every year, not out of charity, but for image. If an underground empire wanted to survive for the long haul, its public face had to stay clean. And nothing looked cleaner than a photograph beside orphans on the front page of the morning paper. Knox stood in the corner of the ballroom with a glass of wine he barely drank, nodding at the right moments, shaking the right hands, saying the exact words that needed to be said. Perry stood beside him, his eyes sweeping the room out of habit, until he tilted his head and murmured, "Your mother just arrived. She visited Elise's grave this afternoon and came straight here." Knox didn't turn. He didn't react, but his hand tightened slightly around the stem of the glass. Elise, his sister, gone at only 5 years old, 27 years ago, in an accident no one in the family ever spoke of again. Today was the anniversary of her death, and his mother still visited her grave every year, still brought white flowers, still sat beside the stone marker, and spoke to the little girl who would never grow even one more day older. Then she wiped her eyes, got into the car, came to the party, and smiled at 300 strangers, as if she hadn't been kneeling at her daughter's grave 2 hours earlier. Knox knew. He always knew. But he never went with his mother to the cemetery, because standing before Elise's grave meant he would have to feel, and Knox had spent far too many years forgetting how to do that. Genevieve Aldridge entered the ballroom, and the entire room seemed to incline toward her by instinct. 60 years old, back straight, steps steady, eyes so sharp people forgot she had cried that afternoon. She nodded to Knox from a distance, didn't come closer, didn't embrace him. The two of them loved each other the way people do who have lost too much, with just enough distance that neither one had to admit how badly they were hurting. Around 9 o'clock, Genevieve left the main ballroom to find the restroom. She walked down the back corridor near the kitchens, where the sound of clattering dishes and the smell of food mixed with the scent of dishwater. She heard it before she saw it. 3 months of wages will cover the damages. Get out of here. Right, now. The man's voice was loud, thick with alcohol and cheap authority. Genevieve stopped at the corner of the hallway and looked across. A man in a black suit, the restaurant manager, was pointing a finger in the face of a young woman. The girl wore a server's uniform, her hair tied back neatly, her frame thin, standing in the middle of a puddle spilled across the floor. Clearly, she had spilled something on a guest, and the price she was being made to pay was 3 months of wages swallowed whole, along with a dismissal shouted through a dirty hallway. Genevieve waited. She waited for the girl to cry. She waited for her to beg. She waited for her to shout that it wasn't fair, that 3 months of wages were all she had in the world. But the girl did none of that. She stood still and looked straight into the manager's face. She didn't lower her head. She didn't tremble. Then she lifted her hands, pulled the apron over her head, and folded it. She folded it neatly, the edges even, smoothing the crease with the palm of her hand. She placed the white apron on the stainless steel table beside her, gently, carefully, as though it were the last thing in this world she still had control over. Then she turned away and walked, without looking back. Genevieve stood there watching until the girl's figure disappeared completely through the emergency exit door at the end of the corridor. She didn't chase after her. She didn't call her back. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the wall, looking at the white apron folded so neatly on the stainless steel table. She didn't know the girl's name. She didn't know where she came from, where she lived, or whether anyone was waiting for her at home. But Genevieve Aldridge, the woman who had knelt at her daughter's grave that afternoon, recognized something no one else in that hallway had seen. That girl hadn't folded the apron out of habit. She folded it because it was the only way left to keep her dignity when everything else had already been taken from her. And Genevieve knew that feeling, knew it more clearly than anyone. 4 days after the charity gala, Genevieve Aldridge sat in the back seat of a black Bentley on her way to her regular heart checkup at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She had been going once a month ever since the doctor discovered an irregular heartbeat 3 years earlier. Knox didn't know about it. She hadn't told him, and she had no intention of telling him. Her son was already carrying more than enough. He didn't need his mother's failing heart added to the list. The car pulled up in front of the hospital's main entrance, a little before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Chicago was caught in one of those relentless rains, the kind that wasn't heavy but never stopped, soaking into the bones one drop at a time. Genevieve was waiting for the driver to circle around and open her door when her gaze stopped at a stone bench outside the entrance. A young woman was sitting there, curled in on herself, her knees drawn tight against her chest, wet hair plastered to her face. Her body was trembling in a steady rhythm, not from the cold, but with the shudder of someone burning with fever. At her feet was a torn backpack, the kind a schoolgirl might carry, faded with age and frayed at both straps. She was sitting right in front of the emergency entrance, and yet she didn't go inside. Genevieve recognized her at once. The same thin frame, the same way of folding herself inward, trying to take up as little space as possible. And those eyes that 4 days earlier had looked straight into the face of the manager firing her without so much as a blink. The driver opened the door and raised an umbrella. "Ma'am, the hospital is right there." But Genevieve didn't walk toward the hospital. She walked toward the bench. "Ma'am, the rain is getting heavier." She waved him off. The driver stopped where he was, holding the umbrella, watching his 60-year-old employer walk through the rain toward a strange girl she did not know at all. Genevieve sat down on the bench, right beside Wren. In the middle of the rain, with no umbrella and no coat, rainwater began to seep through the silk of her blouse, but she didn't move. Wren turned to look at her. Her eyes were dull with fever, yet still sharp, still reading the person beside her faster than most healthy people ever could. She recognized this woman. She recognized the expensive clothes, the straight-backed posture, the perfume she had only ever smelled while serving the VIP tables. She knew this woman had been a guest at the gala. "I'm not asking for money," Wren said first, her voice rough with fever. "I'm just sitting here." Genevieve didn't answer at once. She looked at the girl, more closely than she had in that kitchen corridor. Dry, cracked lips, one hand clutching something small against her chest, folded into a neat square and hidden beneath the thin shirt soaked through with rain. The girl held that thing as if she were holding the most precious thing in the world, while her own body shook and no one was there to hold her. "Why don't you go inside?" Genevieve asked. "No insurance, no money. What would be the point? To get treatment. Sitting here at least keeps me close to doctors if I pass out," Wren said, as if she were stating the most ordinary fact in the world. There was no self-pity in it, no attempt to make herself sound tragic. She was simply presenting a truth she had accepted a long time ago. Genevieve fell silent for a moment. Rain fell onto her silver hair and ran down along her cheekbones. She looked as though she were crying, but she wasn't. Or maybe she truly was, and the rain was kindly hiding it for her. "The girl folded her apron so neatly that day," Genevieve said softly. "In the kitchen hallway, at the charity gala." "Who taught you to do that?" Wren looked at her. She didn't ask how Genevieve knew. She didn't ask why she remembered. She only stayed quiet for a few seconds, as though the question had touched something deeper than she expected. "My mother," Wren said, her voice lower now, almost blending into the sound of rain. "She said that even if you lose everything, you mustn't lose the way you treat your belongings, because the way you treat the smallest thing is how people know who you are." "Where is your mother now?" "Gone. 4 years now." Genevieve didn't say "I'm sorry." She knew how meaningless those words could be to someone who had lost her mother. She only nodded, very slowly, as if she understood something that needed no explanation. Her eyes came to rest on the thing Wren was clutching against her chest. A small handkerchief, old cotton worn soft and thin, embroidered with a few sprigs of lavender in pale violet thread at one corner. Wren held that handkerchief in both hands, clutching it tight as if she were afraid the rain might sweep it away, while her whole body was drenched and shaking beyond control. This girl was holding her mother's handkerchief more carefully than she was holding herself. Genevieve looked at the embroidered lavender, and she saw an old photograph. A photograph of Knox at 5 years old, holding Elise in his arms. She saw the white flowers she had placed on her daughter's grave 4 days earlier. She saw 27 years of grief, pressed tight inside her chest, beating there in an unsteady rhythm. She didn't know this girl's name. She didn't know where she came from. She didn't know whether she was worthy or not, whether she could be trusted or not, whether she was a good person or not. But she knew one thing. Sitting before her was a daughter who had lost her mother, clutching the only thing her mother had left behind. In the rain, outside a hospital she was too afraid to enter. And Genevieve Aldridge, a mother who had lost her daughter 27 years earlier, could not stand up and walk away a second time. "Come with me." Wren looked at her, her eyes narrowed. 4 years of surviving on the streets had taught her that no one gave anything to anyone for free. Where? Home. The Aldridge estate stood in Lincoln Park, hidden behind 10-foot iron fencing and 2 layers of security gates. By the time the black Bentley carrying Genevieve and Wren pulled up beneath the main entrance, Knox was already standing on the front steps. Not because he had been waiting, but because the security cameras had alerted Perry. Perry had alerted Knox, and Knox wanted to know why his mother was bringing a stranger into a house that held enough secrets to bury an entire city. Wren stepped out of the car first. She couldn't stand steadily because of the fever, but she stood. Her eyes swept over the estate in one quick pass, not with admiration, but with assessment. The kind of look belonging to someone who had learned to read the landscape before stepping into any place at all. Then her gaze stopped on Knox, standing at the top of the steps, and she understood at once that this man wasn't pleased she was here. Genevieve stepped out after her. She didn't explain. She walked straight up the steps, stopped in front of Knox, and said only one sentence. "The girl will stay here. This isn't a suggestion." Knox looked at his mother, looked at Wren, then looked back at his mother. "You brought a stranger into this house. I brought home a girl burning with a 104-degree fever who had nowhere to sleep. That's different." "How is it different?" Genevieve looked at her son with the eyes Knox knew well. The eyes she used when she had made up her mind, and there wasn't a force on earth that could change it. "It's different because I wasn't asking your permission." Then she walked into the house. Wren followed behind her, passing Knox without looking at him, without lowering her head, without saying a word. She moved past him the way someone moves past a doorway, nothing more and nothing less. Knox stood there watching her and realized something strange. This girl didn't care enough to fear him, not because she was brave, but because she was used to things far worse than a wealthy, angry man. 20 minutes later, in his office, Knox called Perry. "Look into her. Everything. Name, age, background, criminal history, social connections. I want to know what she ate for breakfast before my mother picked her up." It took Perry less than 2 hours. The results fit onto a single sheet of paper, so thin it was almost pitiful. Wren Casey, 21 years old. Born in the outskirts of Peoria, Illinois. Mother Lillian Casey, dead 4 years ago from lung disease. Father unknown, gone before she was born. No siblings, no relatives, no criminal record, no organization ties, no insurance, no bank account, no fixed address for the past 2 years. Most recent job, waitress at Le Marin, fired. Before that, dishwashing, hotel housekeeping, kitchen assistant, every job temporary, every wage low, none lasting more than a few months. "Clean," Perry said, laying the paper on Knox's desk. "So clean she almost doesn't exist. She's not a threat. She's nobody." Knox read the paper, then read it again, then pushed it aside. "My mother visited Elise's grave the afternoon of the charity gala. Then that same night she saw this girl. 4 days later she brought her home." Knox lifted his eyes to Perry. "Do you see the coincidence in that?" Perry didn't answer, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. Genevieve Aldridge didn't act on impulse. She acted from pain, and Elise's anniversary was the day that pain rose to its highest point. Knox called Tate Mercer, the family's private attorney, and asked him to confirm whether bringing a stranger into the estate created any legal risk. Tate confirmed there was no issue as long as no binding contract existed. Knox ended the call without saying thank you. He never said thank you. That night, after the house had gone quiet and everyone else was asleep, Knox walked down the second-floor corridor. Wren's room was at the far end, the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Wren was sitting on the bed, still wearing the same wet clothes from that afternoon, unchanged. Not because she had nothing else to wear. Ruth had already left a change of clothes on the chair, but Wren wasn't used to accepting things from strangers, and 4 years on the streets had taught her never to take off her shoes in a place where she might have to run at any moment. Knox stood in the doorway. Wren looked at him. She didn't rise. She didn't move back. She only looked. "I don't know who you are," Knox said, his voice low and even. "I don't trust you. My mother may see in you whatever she wants to see, but I'm not my mother. I look at people through reality, not emotion." He took one step farther into the room. "If you do anything that harms my mother, even a word, an action, anything at all, you'll be gone from this house before you can remember the way in." He waited for her to lower her head, waited for her to promise, waited for fear. Wren looked at him, her fever-bright eyes still steady, and said in a hoarse voice that didn't tremble, "I'm not afraid of you. I've been afraid of things much worse than you." Knox stood there for another 3 seconds. No one said anything else. Then he turned and walked out, closed the door behind him, and remained standing in the hallway for a long time before returning to his own room. For 7 years, everyone had feared Knox Aldridge. Rivals feared him. Subordinates feared him. Business partners feared him. Even the people closest to him kept a certain distance, because they understood Knox was not a man to test. And now, a 21-year-old girl, burning with a 104-degree fever, with nothing to her name except a torn backpack and her mother's lavender-embroidered handkerchief, had just looked him in the eye and told him she wasn't afraid. Knox didn't know what to do with that. For the first time in 7 years, he had come face to face with a wall his silence couldn't break through. During the first week, Wren Casey lived in the Aldridge estate as if she didn't exist. That wasn't a metaphor. She truly turned herself into air. She ate so little that Ruth, the 62-year-old housekeeper who had served the Aldridge family for 30 years, had to inspect the dinner plates afterward just to confirm that someone had actually sat at the table. A few small bites would be missing, just enough so it wouldn't be obvious that she hadn't eaten, but never enough to call it a meal. Wren ate like someone stealing food inside the very house whose mistress had invited her in. She asked for nothing. She didn't ask for the Wi-Fi password. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't touch anything in the room except the bed and the bathroom. Ruth had left 3 sets of clothes for her, a pair of house slippers, towels, and a toothbrush. 2 days later, the clothes were still folded exactly as they had been left on the chair, and the toothbrush was still in its wrapper. Wren used her own things instead, the 1 set of clothes in her backpack, washed by hand and hung over the bar in the bathroom to dry. Every night before sleeping, she checked the lock on the bedroom door, checked the window, checked the distance from the bed to the door, counting the steps, committing them to memory. Her time spent drifting taught her that sleep was a luxury, and the person who slept too deeply was the person who couldn't run when it became necessary. She made no sound, left no trace. She moved through the house with steps so light that even Ruth, who had the sharpest hearing in the Aldridge household, startled when she turned and found Wren standing behind her. "Good Lord, child, you nearly frightened me to death," Ruth said, pressing a hand to her chest. "What do you walk on that I can't hear a thing?" Wren didn't explain. It wasn't that she was trying to walk quietly. She had simply forgotten how to walk any other way. Over the past 4 years, heavy footsteps meant being noticed, and being noticed was rarely a good thing when she was sleeping in places where she wasn't supposed to sleep. Knox watched all of it from a distance. He didn't speak to Wren, didn't greet her, didn't look at her when they passed each other in the halls, but he saw. He saw the plates come back almost untouched. He saw the clothes Ruth had left still undisturbed. He saw this girl take up as little space as possible in a house with 20 rooms, as though she were afraid that if she occupied too much of it, someone would notice she was here and throw her out. He said nothing. Not yet. On the 5th day, Wren was walking past the laundry room in the basement when she heard voices drifting out from inside. 2 maids were folding bed linens, unaware that someone was standing outside the door. I heard the mistress picked her up off the street. Literally, sitting in the rain outside the hospital. A stray cat the mistress brought home. Feed her, clothe her, and sooner or later she'll still be sent away. Just wait and see. The mistress may feel sorry for her, but Mr. Knox, everyone knows him. He won't accept it. Poor thing. But still, She's got nerve. Moving into this house. Doesn't she know what kind of house this is? How would she know anything? Just a parasite. Wren stood outside the door and heard every word. One by one. Her face didn't change. Her hands didn't curl into fists. She only stood there with her back against the wall, drew in one long breath, and then turned away. She didn't step inside to argue. She didn't step inside to ask anything. Life as a runaway had shown her that what others said about her mattered less than the choices she made for herself, and Wren had made her choice. That night, Ruth went to check on Wren's room before the gates were locked, as she always did. She pushed open the door and found Wren sitting on the floor with her torn backpack open in front of her, folding the lavender handkerchief and placing it inside along with the only set of clothes she owned. She was packing carefully, neatly, with the practiced movements of someone who had packed and unpacked this same backpack hundreds of times. "Where are you going?" Ruth asked, her voice not raised, but sharp enough. Wren didn't look up. "I don't want to wait until I'm thrown out. Leaving first is the only way to keep a little self-respect." Ruth looked at the girl sitting on the floor of a guest room, larger than any rented room she herself had never been able to afford for more than 2 months. She looked at the torn backpack that held the sum total of an entire life belonging to a 21-year-old girl. She looked at the hands folding things neatly, precisely, every crease like part of a ritual. Then Ruth lowered herself onto the floor beside Wren. Her knees cracked from age, but she didn't care. "Listen to me," Ruth said. Her voice wasn't soft, wasn't sweet, wasn't comforting. It was straight and plain, the voice of someone speaking truth without wrapping it in sugar. "I've been in this house for 30 years. I've seen all kinds of people come and go. Friends, partners, lovers, enemies, all of them. But Mrs. Genevieve has never, do you hear me? Never sat down on a bench in the rain with anyone. Never." Ruth looked straight into Wren's eyes. "She sat down with you. In the middle of the rain. No umbrella. Soaked through a $4,000 outfit. Do you think she did that out of pity? Or because she saw something in you that even you don't yet know you have?" Wren was silent. Her hands stopped midway, the lavender handkerchief resting in her palm, for a long time. Then she unpacked the backpack, folded her clothes again and placed them on the chair, set the lavender handkerchief on the bedside table. But she slid the torn backpack beneath the bed. She didn't throw it away, didn't put it in the closet. She left it right there underneath, where her hand could reach it in 3 seconds if she needed to, because Wren Casey might stay. But she had never believed she was truly allowed to stay anywhere. In the second week, Wren began to realize that the Aldridge estate wasn't simply the home of a wealthy family. Men came and went at strange hours. Meetings took place behind closed doors, and no one ever mentioned them once they were over. There were phone calls Perry would answer that made the color leave his face, and then he and Knox would disappear into the night at once. Wren didn't ask. Years of surviving alone had taught her that curiosity was a luxury people with nothing shouldn't spend money on, but there were things she didn't need to ask about in order to see them. That afternoon, Wren was passing Knox's study on the second floor. The door wasn't fully closed, left open just enough for light to spill through the gap. Her footsteps were light as air, and old habit made her stop before she even realized she had stopped. Inside, Knox sat behind the desk. Across from him sat a middle-aged man in a gray suit, the kind of man who looked as though he had worked for the family for many years. The man was sweating even though the room was air-conditioned. Knox said nothing at first. He simply placed 2 things on the desk: a thick envelope, the brown kind Wren guessed was full of cash, and a plane ticket, one way. "Choose," Knox said, his voice as gentle as though he were offering tea. "This envelope is enough for you to start over in another city. A flight to Portland leaves tonight, or you stay, and I deal with this in the way neither of us wants." The man looked at the envelope, looked at the ticket, looked at Knox. Then he picked up the envelope with both trembling hands, stood, and walked out of the room without daring to glance back even once. Knox didn't watch him go. He turned back to the laptop screen, as if the man who had just left mattered no more than an unread email. Wren stood outside the door with her back against the wall, breathing very quietly. She wasn't afraid. That surprised even her. She had just watched Knox Aldridge deal with a traitor, using nothing but an envelope of money and a one-way ticket, without raising his voice, without making threats, simply sitting there and saying 2 words, "Choose," in the calmest tone in the world, and she wasn't afraid. She only saw something that perhaps no one else in that house saw. Knox Aldridge wasn't cruel because he enjoyed it. He was cruel because he had to be. It was a burden, not a privilege. And Wren, who had carried enough heavy things in her life, recognized a burden when she saw it resting on someone else's shoulders. She walked away before Knox realized she had been standing there. That same afternoon, while Ruth was tidying the first floor, Wren wandered into the Aldridge family gallery. It was a small room at the end of the second-floor hall. The kind of room no one locked, but no one invited anyone into either. Family photographs hung on the walls in chronological order. The earlier Aldridges, Knox's father, a man with a stern face but kind eyes, standing beside Genevieve 30 years younger. Then Knox at 5 years old, his face round, grinning wide, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket. Wren stopped in front of that photograph. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the smile on the face of little Knox, a smile she had never once seen on the face of the 37-year-old man living under the same roof with her. She looked at the tiny newborn in his arms. She looked at the way the boy held his sister, carefully, as though he were afraid she might break. "What was your sister's name?" Wren's voice sounded through the empty room, and when she turned, she saw Knox standing in the doorway. How long he had been there, she didn't know. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were different. His eyes looked at that photograph the way someone looks into a wound he has spent 7 years pretending not to have. Knox didn't answer. He stood there for 2 more seconds, then turned and walked away. His footsteps were quicker than usual, as if he were leaving a dangerous place, even though that place held nothing but an old photograph and one simple question from a 21-year-old girl. Wren watched him go. She didn't apologize. She didn't run after him. She only turned back to the photograph one more time, looked again at the 5-year-old boy grinning as he held his baby sister, and understood that Knox Aldridge wasn't cold because he had been born cold. He was cold because he had once been very warm, and losing that warmth had nearly killed him. The next morning, Knox was sitting in his study when Perry came in with the usual report. At the end of it, when Perry had already picked up the file and was about to leave, Knox suddenly asked without lifting his eyes from the screen, "What was her mother's name?" Perry stopped. "Which her?" Knox still didn't look up. "The girl, Wren Casey. What was her mother's name?" Perry flipped back through the thin file he had practically memorized the week before. Lillian Casey. Died 4 years ago. Lung disease. At a public hospital in Peoria. Knox nodded. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't explain why he was asking. Perry didn't ask either. But when he stepped out into the hallway, Perry paused for a beat, looked toward the family gallery at the end of the corridor, then back at the door to Knox's study that had just closed behind him. In 7 years working beside Knox Aldridge, Perry had never heard Knox ask for anyone's name unless there was a reason tied to business. This was the first time, and Perry knew the name Lillian Casey wouldn't stop at that file. It was going to go much farther than that. He just didn't yet know how far. At the end of the 3rd week, Genevieve called Wren into her private room. When Wren stepped inside, Genevieve was sitting at her dressing table, holding a small old velvet box in a deep blue-black shade. She opened it, and inside lay a delicate silver necklace with a tiny teardrop pendant no bigger than a fingertip. Simple, but exquisite in the way old family pieces often are. "This belonged to Elise," Genevieve said, her voice calm, though her hands were not, her fingers trembling faintly as they touched the necklace. "I bought it for her when she was born. She never had the chance to wear it." She turned and looked at Wren. "I want you to keep this." Wren stepped back. "I can't accept that. I'm not asking whether you can or can't. I'm telling you I want you to keep it." Wren looked at the necklace in the velvet box, then at Genevieve, then back at the necklace. She didn't know how to respond when a woman who was almost a stranger offered her the most precious thing in her life. She had never received a gift from anyone except the lavender handkerchief her mother had placed in her hand before closing her eyes for the last time. Knox found out about it 15 minutes later, when Ruth mentioned it by accident while tidying the kitchen. He went straight upstairs to Genevieve's room, shut the door behind him, and the argument began at once. Not the kind of argument people have by shouting. The Aldridges didn't argue that way. They argued in low voices, each word sharp as a blade, and somehow that was worse. "You gave Elise's necklace to a stranger. She isn't a stranger. She's been here less than a month. She is a stranger. To you, maybe, not to me." Knox took one step closer, his voice lower now, heavier. "You're replacing her. Do you realize that? You're taking Elise's things. The room that used to be Elise's. And now Elise's necklace too. And you're giving all of it to a girl you picked up off the street. You're erasing her little by little. Genevieve stood up. She wasn't as tall as Knox. But when she stood straight and looked at her son with those eyes, height stopped mattering. My daughter has been dead for 27 years, Knox. I'm not replacing her. No one could replace her. I'm trying to keep living. She paused. What about you? Have you kept living? Or are you still standing still at 5 years old, watching your sister go, refusing to let anyone step into that emptiness? Knox didn't answer. His jaw tightened, the muscle at his temple jumping once. Then he turned and walked out, closing his mother's door harder than he needed to. That night, Knox came home late. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning before he returned to the estate from Aldridge Holdings, tired in the way that began in the bones, the kind of exhaustion no amount of sleep could mend. He passed through the kitchen to get water and stopped. The kitchen was dark. Only the dim light above the sink was on. Wren sat alone at the island in the middle of the room, in front of her half a loaf of bread and a glass of water. She was eating in tiny bites, slowly, in complete silence. The habit of someone used to eating when no one could see, used to eating at hours when no one checked, used to taking just enough so it wouldn't be noticed that anything had been taken. Knox stood in the kitchen doorway. Wren looked up at him. The two of them were silent. Then Knox walked in. He opened the refrigerator, took out the plate Ruth left for him every night, and set it in front of Wren. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, his hands clasped together on the table, his eyes lowered, as if he too needed somewhere to sit at 2 o'clock in the morning without having to explain himself to anyone. Wren looked at the plate of food, looked at Knox. Then she pulled the plate closer and began to eat. She didn't say thank you. She didn't ask why. She just ate, and he just sat there. And in the dark kitchen, the only sound was the faint touch of the plate against the stone countertop. 15 minutes later, Wren let her head fall onto the table. She had drifted off to sleep. Her body leaned to one side, one hand still resting beside the plate, one knee drawn up onto the chair, the sleep of someone too exhausted to keep herself awake for even 1 second more. Knox looked at her, looked longer than he should have. Then he stood, took off his suit jacket, and draped it over Wren's shoulders. He stood there a few seconds longer, then walked away. He didn't wake her. He didn't carry her back to her room. He only covered her with his jacket and left. He went upstairs, along the second-floor hallway. Wren's room was at the far end, the door slightly ajar, her table lamp still glowing. She must have forgotten to turn it off before coming downstairs to the kitchen. Knox was about to walk past when he heard a voice from inside, soft, small, almost a whisper. He stopped. "I'm okay, Mom." It was Wren's voice, but not the voice she used for the living. Softer, smaller, more fragile. "I have a place to sleep now. The bed is huge. If you saw it, you'd probably laugh. There's even a thick blanket. It's really warm." Knox stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, his eyes closing. She was talking to the lavender handkerchief, talking to her mother. A 21-year-old girl with no one left in the world was sitting alone in her room, holding the old handkerchief of her dead mother, telling her that she was okay, that she had a place to sleep, that the bed was huge, that her mother didn't need to worry. Knox stood there for how long? He didn't know. Then he walked away, back to his room, closed the door, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He thought about Elise, thought about the photograph of a 5-year-old boy holding his baby sister, thought about the silver necklace his mother had given Wren that afternoon, thought about the question his mother had asked him, "Have you kept living?" He still didn't know the answer, but for the first time in 7 years, he admitted that the question mattered. The next morning, Wren was sitting at the breakfast table when Knox came downstairs. She was wearing his suit jacket over the borrowed sleepwear Ruth had lent her, clearly not knowing whom to return it to because no one had admitted to draping it over her shoulders the night before. Knox walked past the breakfast table, stopped for a single beat, and nodded to Wren. Just a nod. He didn't speak. Then he poured his coffee and walked away. Wren watched him go. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything. But her hand loosened around her glass of milk, and for the first time since she had stepped into this house, her shoulders lowered just a little. That afternoon, Knox sat across from Wren at lunch, because Genevieve had insisted the whole family eat together. Wren held her spoon in her left hand, and Knox saw her palm, calloused, thickened skin at the base of her fingers. and a thin scar running across the center of her palm, the mark of someone who had washed thousands of dishes with bare hands, had carried thousands of hot plates without gloves, had cut herself on broken ceramic, and had no money for stitches. So she had let it heal on its own. Knox didn't ask. He didn't look for long. He turned back to his plate and ate as though nothing had happened. The next day, a small first aid kit appeared on the table in Wren's room. A white box, fully stocked with bandages, antiseptic, and hand cream. There was no note, no message, no name. Wren looked at the first aid kit. She set her hand on the lid, her fingers brushing the clean white plastic, and stood there for a long time. She didn't need to ask who had put it there. In this house, there was only one person who had noticed her hands and said nothing. The same person who had set a plate of food in front of her at 2 o'clock in the morning without saying anything. The same person who had draped his jacket over her shoulders without saying anything. Knox Aldridge didn't know how to care with words, but he was beginning to learn how to care through the things he left behind unsigned. Jonah Thatcher had known about the Aldridge family long before Knox inherited the empire from his father. Thatcher ran an underground financial network stretching from Chicago to Detroit, the kind of network that on paper looked like investment funds and consulting firms, but beneath the surface was money laundering, loan sharking, and real estate seizures through contracts the people signing them never truly had a choice about. 45 years old, salt and pepper hair brushed back, suits always perfectly tailored, a smile always arriving at exactly the right time and in exactly the right place. Thatcher was the most dangerous kind of man in the underworld, the kind everyone mistook for a successful businessman, until they realized, far too late, what he really was. For 7 years, Thatcher had watched Knox Aldridge, searching for an opening, a weakness, anything that could be used as leverage to push the Aldridge family out of territory he wanted to claim. 7 years, and he had found nothing. Knox had no lover, no close friend besides Perry, no bad habits, no debt, no secret large enough to exploit. Genevieve was protected so completely that even touching her would amount to a declaration of war, and Thatcher wasn't ready for that war yet, until last month, when Thatcher's people reported that the Aldridge estate had a new resident, a young woman, 21 years old, unclear background, not staff, not family, not a lover. Genevieve Aldridge had brought her home and treated her like a daughter. More interesting than that, Knox Aldridge, the man who for 7 years had cared about no one but his mother, had begun to change in small ways. He had told Perry to investigate the girl's background. He had argued with his mother because of the girl. He had sat in the kitchen with the girl at 2 o'clock in the morning. Thatcher didn't care who the girl was. He cared what the girl was turning Knox into. For 7 years, Knox Aldridge had been a fortress with no door. Now, for the first time, there was a door, and Thatcher only needed to find a way to force it open. That same week, Tate Mercer called Knox. The young lawyer spoke briefly and plainly. The girl living in the estate had no legal standing of any kind. She wasn't adopted. She wasn't under guardianship. There was no binding contract. Legally, Wren Casey did not belong to the Aldridge family in any way that could be protected. Knox listened, ended the call, and said nothing more. On Saturday morning, Wren slipped out of the estate. She didn't think of it as slipping out. She only wanted to have coffee somewhere outside, the kind of $2.50 coffee in a paper cup she had been used to drinking for 4 years, not the imported espresso Ruth made every morning in a machine that looked like laboratory equipment. She walked out through the side gate, nodded to the guard as if she were only taking a normal walk, and stepped onto the streets of Lincoln Park at 9 o'clock that morning. She found a small coffee shop 4 blocks from the estate, the kind with old wooden chairs and free Wi-Fi. She ordered a black coffee, sat beside the window, and for the first time in nearly a month, she breathed without feeling walls around her. Then a man sat down across from her, 45 years old, light gray suit, salt and pepper hair, an easy smile, a latte in his hand as though he had already been there before she arrived. "This place makes the best coffee in the area," the man said in a friendly voice. "I'm guessing that's why you came too." Wren looked at him. 4 years on the streets had taught her many things, and one of the most important was this. Strange men never sat down at a young woman's table in a coffee shop without a reason. His smile came too perfectly on cue. His eyes were too natural. His opening line felt too prepared. But Wren didn't stand up and walk away. 4 years on the streets had also taught her that sometimes, sitting still and listening to what the other person wanted was safer than turning her back on someone whose intentions she didn't yet understand. "I like cheap coffee," Wren replied, her voice calm. The man laughed. "I'm Jonah Thatcher. I work in finance." He slid a business card across the table, the kind printed in raised lettering on thick, expensive stock. "I'm expanding a few projects in this area, and I'm always looking for fresh faces. Do you live around here?" "Temporarily." Wren took the business card. She didn't look at it. She looked at Thatcher, looked at the way he sat, the way he held the cup, the way his eyes flicked over her wrist looking for a watch, over her shirt pocket looking for a phone, over her fingers looking for a ring. He was reading her, and Wren knew it, because she was reading him too. "Nice to meet you." Thatcher left the sentence hanging, waiting for her to fill in her name. "Same to you." Wren smiled politely, stood up, and picked up both her coffee and the card. "I have to go. Thanks for the conversation." She walked out of the shop without looking back. But she walked faster than usual, and she didn't return to the estate by the direct route. She cut across 2 extra blocks, changed direction once, and checked whether anyone was following her. No one was. But she knew men like Thatcher didn't need to follow. He had known where she was before he ever sat down. 20 minutes later, Wren was standing in Knox's study. She set the business card on his desk. "Someone approached me at the coffee shop this morning," she said, brief and direct. "Jonah Thatcher, said he worked in finance, gave me his card, asked where I lived." Knox looked at the card. His face didn't change. Not a single muscle moved. But in his right hand he was holding a ballpoint pen, and the pen snapped in half with a dry crack. "Did he touch you?" That was the first question. Not what did he say, not what did he want, but did he touch you? No. Wren looked at the broken pen in Knox's hand. "We just talked. Tell me every word," he said. "Every single word," Wren told him. Briefly, precisely, leaving out nothing. The way Thatcher sat down, the opening line, the eyes, the business card, the question about where she lived, and the way she had left without giving him her name. Knox listened, in silence. Then he picked up the phone and called Perry. "Thatcher approached Wren this morning. I want to know how many men he has in Chicago, where they're stationed, and what he's moving around in. Before tonight." He ended the call, looked at Wren. "From now on, you don't go out alone." It was the first time Knox Aldridge had called Wren you instead of calling her by the more distant form of address he had always used before. Neither of them noticed it. But Ruth, standing just outside the door with a tray of tea in her hands, noticed it very clearly. 2 days later, Knox arranged to meet Thatcher on his own initiative, not through an intermediary, not through lawyers. He called Thatcher's private number directly, the number only a handful of people in Chicago's underworld possessed, and said exactly one sentence. "Gibson's. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Back table." Then he hung up. Perry drove Knox to the restaurant. On the way there, Perry asked, "What do you want me to bring?" Knox kept his gaze on the window. "Bring patience. We'll need more than usual tonight." Perry didn't ask anything else. Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse sat in the Gold Coast, the kind of restaurant where a single steak cost as much as a month's rent for the kind of room Wren used to live in. Knox arrived 5 minutes early. Thatcher arrived exactly on time. The 2 men sat at the last table in the private dining room, where the dim amber light was enough to show a man's face, but not enough for anyone at a distance to read his lips. Perry sat at the bar outside, his eyes never leaving the door to the private room. Thatcher smiled as he sat down, the kind of smile worn by a man certain he held the stronger position. He ordered red wine, swirled the glass slowly, and waited for Knox to speak first. Knox didn't speak first. He ordered steak, medium rare, and began eating when the food arrived, slowly, calmly, cutting each piece with steady precision, as if he had come there for dinner rather than for the man across from him. Thatcher lasted 3 minutes before his patience ran out. "I appreciate you taking the initiative to meet, Knox. It shows you're a practical man." Knox cut another piece of steak. He didn't look up. Thatcher leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I'll be direct. The girl your mother brought home, she isn't your blood. She isn't your family. She's a variable you don't need. Hand her over to me, make her part of an arrangement between us, and I'll pull out of the entire Southside territory. Clean. Simple." Knox chewed slowly, swallowed, dabbed his mouth with the cloth napkin. Then he lifted his eyes to Thatcher for the first time since sitting down. She's my sister. Thatcher blinked. Then he laughed. The laugh of a man who thought he had just heard a very good joke. Your sister? Knox. She's a homeless girl your mother picked up off the street less than 2 months ago. She's a stray cat. You feed it, it stays. But it isn't a house cat. Don't confuse pity with family. Knox set down his knife, set down his fork. Slowly, precisely, the 2 pieces of silverware lay parallel on the plate, a finger's width apart. Then he placed both hands on the table and laced his fingers together. The restaurant wasn't truly quiet. There was still soft music, the sound of glasses touching, the low murmur of conversation from other tables. But the air around their table changed. Thatcher felt it. The smile on his face slowed, then disappeared. Knox looked at Thatcher. Not angry, not cold. Calm. Completely, absolutely calm. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Because when one man hears another insult his family and does not become angry, it means he doesn't need anger. He had already made his decision before he ever sat down. Jonah, Knox said, so softly Thatcher had to lean in to hear him. You just called my sister something you won't want me to remember. I'm going to grant you a privilege I don't offer many people. I'm going to forget that you said it. Once. Because if I remember, then our next conversation won't take place in a restaurant. Thatcher sat still. The smile was gone entirely now. For the first time that evening, he looked at Knox Aldridge and no longer saw a young boss protecting a worthless piece on the board. He saw a man prepared to burn down everything for a girl he had called a stray cat. And Thatcher, who had survived in the underworld for 20 years by reading people well, realized he had just read this one completely wrong. Knox stood, adjusted his jacket, set enough cash on the table to cover dinner for both of them without bothering to count it. The steak here is quite good, he said, his voice back to normal, as though nothing at all had happened 30 seconds earlier. You should try the dessert. Then he walked away, back straight, steps even, never looking back. Thatcher sat alone at the half-finished table, a glass of dark red wine in his hand. He remained there for 5 minutes before he could stand. Not because he was afraid, but because for the first time in 20 years, he understood that he had just touched the one thing he never should have touched. Not the Aldridge Empire, not the money or the territory, but the only thing Knox Aldridge valued more than the empire itself, the people he called family. On the drive home, Knox said nothing to Perry. Perry didn't ask. The 2 of them sat in silence for 15 minutes until the car pulled up in front of the estate. Knox stepped inside and found Wren sitting in the sitting room, reading an old book she had taken from Genevieve's shelf. He stopped in the doorway. Wren, she looked up. From now on, you don't go anywhere alone. Wherever you go, someone goes with you. No exceptions. Wren closed the book. I can take care of myself. I've been on the streets since I was 17. I know. And on the streets people steal wallets. Knox looked at her, his voice neither rising nor falling, only flat and still as water before a storm. But in this world, they don't steal wallets, they steal people. And I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. Wren looked at him. She wanted to argue. 4 years of surviving on her own had not taught her how to accept being told what to do. But she looked into Knox's eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Not command, not control. Worry. The kind of worry Knox Aldridge did not know how to express through anything except an even voice and short, sharp instructions. She didn't argue. Shkanavana. She only nodded once, lightly, then opened the book and began reading again. Knox remained in the doorway for one more beat. Then he walked away. And Wren heard his footsteps receding down the wooden corridor. Steady, heavy enough to be felt, like the rhythm of a heart trying very hard to keep itself under control. The ultimatum arrived on Monday morning in the form of a white envelope with no sender's name, left right in front of the main gate of the Aldridge estate. Inside was only a single sheet of paper, printed with 4 lines. The girl doesn't belong to your family. Hand her back to the life she came from. Or I'll remind you that the South Side doesn't belong to any one man. You have 1 week. Perry brought the envelope to Knox in his study. Knox read it, folded the paper, and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he said 2 words. Refuse. Perry nodded. He had known the answer before asking. But procedure was procedure. You want me to increase security. Double it. 2 patrol shifts. 4 men at the main gate, 2 at the side gate. Additional cameras on the east and north sides. No one comes in or out without a clear reason. Knox paused for one beat. And Wren doesn't leave the estate until I say she can. Perry stepped out. Within 2 hours, the Aldridge estate had changed. Not in the kind of way anyone outside would have noticed, but Wren noticed at once. She noticed because she had spent 4 years surviving by instinct, by reading the air around her. She noticed more guards. Noticed Perry talking on the phone more often, his voice lower than usual. Noticed Ruth closing the first-floor windows earlier than she always did. Noticed Knox moving in and out of his study over and over. His face still calm, but his footsteps quicker than normal. The house was preparing for a war no one was telling Wren about. She didn't ask. She knew her place. She knew she was still an outsider, even if Genevieve called her daughter. Even if Knox had started calling her by a closer form of address. She knew that whatever was happening had something to do with her, because the air in the house had only changed since the day she stepped into it. That evening, dinner passed in silence. Genevieve tried to keep things normal, asking Wren about the book she was reading, but every few minutes her eyes drifted toward Knox. Knox ate faster than usual, stood before Ruth could even bring out dessert, said he had something to deal with, and disappeared into his study. Perry followed. The door shut, and Wren heard voices continuing behind it until nearly midnight. 11 o'clock. The estate was quiet. Ruth had gone to her room. Genevieve had gone upstairs at 9. Knox and Perry were still in the study. Light spilled through the crack beneath the door, drawing a thin gold line across the wooden hallway floor. Wren lay in bed, but she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, stared at the shadows of tree branches moving outside her window in the wind, and she felt something she had known well during 4 years on the street, the feeling that came just before everything fell apart. The feeling of air tightening, of silence becoming too complete, like the stillness before a storm breaks. She was afraid. Not for herself. She was used to losing everything. She was afraid for the woman sleeping at the far end of the hall. The woman who had sat down on a bench in the rain with her, who had given her her daughter's necklace, who had said, "Come sleep in here with me" on those nights in the first week when Wren woke from nightmares she had never told anyone about. Wren rose from bed, left her room. Her footsteps made no sound, old habit, as she moved along the second-floor hallway to Genevieve's room at the end. She didn't knock. She only sat down, her back against the wall beside the doorframe, her knees drawn up to her chest, and sat there, quietly, in the dark. She didn't know how long she sat there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. But suddenly the door opened, and light from Genevieve's room fell across her face. Genevieve stood in the doorway in her nightrobe, silver hair loose over her shoulders. She looked down at the girl curled beside her bedroom door in the middle of the night, and her eyes softened. "What are you doing here?" Wren looked up. Her eyes weren't red. She wasn't crying, but there was something in them Genevieve recognized at once. The fear of losing, the kind of fear only people who had already lost too much could ever know. "I don't know," Wren said softly. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay, Mom." A second passed. Wren didn't realize what she had just said. She didn't realize that for the first time since Lillian Casey closed her eyes 4 years earlier, she had just called another woman Mom. She hadn't meant to, hadn't prepared it, hadn't thought about it. It came out as naturally as breathing, as though that word had been waiting in her throat for a very long time, just for one moment when she was tired enough, frightened enough, and full enough of love to let it slip free. Genevieve realized it. She realized it instantly. The word Mom touched her like a small hand reaching out from the dark, touching the place inside her chest that no one had touched in 27 years. She didn't react dramatically. She didn't cry. She didn't embrace her. She didn't say, "You just called me Mom," because Genevieve Aldridge understood that some moments, once spoken aloud, shatter. Some things are too fragile to survive the weight of being named. She only opened the door wider. "Come sleep in here with me." Wren stood, walked into the room. Genevieve closed the door behind her. In the large, warm room, Wren lay down beside Genevieve on the oversized bed, far too large for a woman who had slept alone for so many years. Genevieve pulled the blanket over her, naturally, gently, exactly the way a mother tucks in her daughter every night. Wren lay still, eyes open, looking at the ceiling. Then she turned onto her side, facing Genevieve. "Thank you," she whispered. Genevieve didn't ask what she was thanking her for. She only lifted a hand, smoothed Wren's hair once, gently, then closed her eyes. And at the far end of the hallway, Knox had just stepped out of his study. He passed Genevieve's room, saw that the light had just gone out, saw that the door was closed. He paused for a single beat, his hand resting lightly against the wood of the door. Then he lowered his hand and walked to his own room. He didn't know that Wren had just called his mother Mom. He would never know, because Genevieve would never tell him. Some things she kept for herself. Small jewels hidden in the drawer of her heart, where no one could reach, where not even time could take them away. 3 days after the night Wren slept in Genevieve's room, she heard something she wished she had never heard. That afternoon, Knox and Perry were meeting in the study. The door was closed, but the window was slightly open because of the heat, and Wren was sitting on a stone bench in the garden below, directly beneath that window, reading a book. She wasn't trying to listen. She didn't press her ear to the wall. The wind carried Perry's voice down to her, clear, each word distinct, as if he were sitting right beside her. Thatcher isn't targeting her because she has any strategic value, Knox. She doesn't know anything. She has nothing. He's targeting her because of you. Perry paused. For 7 years you didn't have a weakness. No lover, no friends, no one whose harm would distract you. Then Wren appears. And for the first time, you care about someone other than your mother. Thatcher sees that. He doesn't need her. He needs your reaction when she's threatened. That's the opening. Silence. Knox didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough for Wren to hear the wind slipping through the window gap, the rustle of leaves, the sound of her own heartbeat inside her chest. Knox didn't deny it. He didn't say she isn't a weakness. He didn't say I don't care about her. He only stayed silent, and that silence confirmed everything Perry had just said. Wren closed her book, stood up, walked back into the house. Her footsteps were as quiet as always, her face as calm as always. But inside her chest, something had just broken. She was the weakness. She was the reason this family was in danger. She was the thing the enemy would use to strike, and every day she remained here only made everything worse. Genevieve, the woman who had sat in the rain with her, who had given her her daughter's necklace, who had said, "Come sleep in here with me," in the gentlest voice in the world. Knox, the man who had set a plate of food in front of her at 2 o'clock in the morning, without saying a word, Baragenere. All of them were in danger because of her. Because of a homeless girl who owned nothing but a torn backpack and 4 years of wandering. Wren knew what she had to do. She knew it the moment Perry finished speaking. 4 years on the streets had taught her that when she became a burden, the best thing to do was disappear before anyone had to tell her to leave. But this time was different. The last time she packed her bag, it had been out of pride, because she heard the servants call her a stray cat, because she didn't want to wait to be thrown out. This time she wasn't hurt. This time she was loving. And because she was loving, she had to go. She waited until night. Waited until 3 o'clock in the morning. 3 in the morning was the shift change for the guards. Perry had taught her the estate's security procedures in the 3rd week, when he began training her to recognize danger. He had taught her patrol schedules, camera positions, shift rotations, emergency protocols. He had taught her everything to keep her safe, and now she used that knowledge to avoid all of it. In her room, Wren sat on the bed writing a letter. She wrote with a ballpoint pen on a sheet torn from a notebook Ruth had lent her. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes were dry. She had learned how not to cry a long time ago, from before her mother died, from the moment she understood that tears didn't change anything except blur what she needed to see clearly. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how to write a letter like this because I've never had anyone to say goodbye to. These past 4 months have been the happiest months of my life. I didn't know what a home was until you sat down with me on that stone bench in the rain that day. I didn't know what family was until you tucked me in every night without anyone asking you to do it. But I can't stay. Not because I want to leave, but because if I stay, you'll be in danger. You've already lost 1 daughter. I won't let you lose anyone else because of me. I'm leaving Elise's necklace. It belongs to this family, not to me. And I'm leaving my mother Lillian's handkerchief. Because if I take it with me, I won't have the strength to walk out that door. I love you. I haven't said those words to anyone since my mother Lillian died, but I'm saying them to you now, in this letter, because I'm afraid if I say them out loud, I won't be able to leave. Wren." She folded the letter, placed it on the table beside the bed. Next to the letter, she set the silver teardrop necklace Genevieve had given her, and beside the necklace, she placed the lavender-embroidered handkerchief from her mother. The handkerchief she had held every night for 4 years, the only thing she had never let go of. The thing she had held tighter than she had held herself in the rain outside the hospital the day Genevieve found her. She was leaving both of her mothers at the same time, on the same table, side by side. Wren pulled the torn backpack from beneath the bed, the backpack she had kept there since the first day. Never thrown away, never put in the closet, always within reach. 4 months ago, she had told Ruth she kept it there in case she needed to run. Now she needed to. She put on her old clothes, the only clothes that truly belonged to her, packed a few small things into the bag. She took nothing from the wardrobe Genevieve had bought for her, took nothing from this house. She had come with empty hands, and she would leave with empty hands. It was the only way she knew. 3 a.m, shift change. Wren went down the stairs with the kind of steps that 4 years on the streets had worn into her, until no wooden floor could betray her. She passed through the kitchen, opened the back door, stepped into the west courtyard where the cameras swept the slowest and the blind spot was widest. She knew because Perry had shown her on the security map. She slipped in through the side fence at the corner of the garden, where there was a narrow gap just wide enough for a thin person to pass through, a gap the guards had reported many times, but had never been fixed because Knox had prioritized the front. Wren Casey disappeared from the Aldridge estate at 3:07 a.m, without a sound, without a camera capturing her, without a single guard noticing. She stepped into the cold, dark Chicago night, the torn backpack on her shoulders, her hands empty, and on the table in the lit room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the letter, the silver necklace, and the lavender-embroidered handkerchief lay side by side, silent, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone's heart to break in the morning. Ruth found out at 6 o'clock in the morning. She pushed open Wren's door to place fresh towels as she did every day, and she knew at once. The bed was empty. The wardrobe was closed, still full of everything Genevieve had bought. The house slippers were neatly placed beside the bed. The room was clean, orderly, as if Wren had tidied it before leaving, as if she wanted to return it exactly the way she had received it. Then Ruth saw the bedside table, the folded letter, the silver teardrop necklace, and the lavender-embroidered handkerchief. She picked up the handkerchief, and her hand began to tremble, because Ruth knew what that handkerchief was. She knew Wren held it every night. She knew that girl would abandon everything else in the world before she would ever leave that handkerchief behind, and if she had left it, it meant she had left behind the last piece of herself. Ruth didn't read the letter. She gathered everything, the letter, the necklace, the handkerchief, and went straight to Genevieve's room. Genevieve read the letter in silence. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the paper in both hands, and read. When she finished once, she read it again. Then she lowered the paper onto her lap, and her hands began to shake. Not a slight tremor. It started at her fingers, spread to her wrists, up her arms, as if her body were trying to hold on to something her mind had already lost. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, but her whole body trembled, and it was worse than crying. Ruth stood beside her, saying nothing. She knew there were no words that could be right in a moment like this. "Call Knox," Genevieve said, her voice calm in a way that wasn't natural, the kind of calm only people breaking from the inside can manage. Knox was in his mother's room within 2 minutes. He saw Genevieve's face first, then he saw the lavender handkerchief on the bed, then the silver necklace that had belonged to Elise. Then Genevieve handed him the letter. Knox read. His face didn't change through the first 3 lines. At the line, "You've already lost 1 daughter. I won't let you lose anyone else because of me," his jaw tightened. At the line, "I love you. I haven't said those words to anyone since my mother Lillian died." His hand began to shake, just like his mother's, trembling from the fingers up to the wrist. Mother and son shaking the same way, losing the same way, and now losing the same person. Knox finished reading. He folded the letter again, carefully, along the same creases, as if it were something important. Then he crushed it in his hand, squeezing until the paper crumpled into a tight ball. "Perry," he said, his voice flat. "Car, now." Then he walked out of his mother's room, went down to his study, and shut the door behind him. 3 seconds later, Ruth heard the desk flip. A heavy, dull sound. Wood striking wood, then glass shattering. 1 piece. 2. Then silence. Perry arrived at the estate 10 minutes later. He stepped into the study and saw the desk overturned. Broken glass across the floor, papers scattered everywhere. Knox stood in the middle of the room, both hands braced against the overturned desk, his head bowed, his breathing heavy. It was the first time in 7 years Perry had seen Knox Aldridge lose control. He had seen Knox face betrayal, loss, The day his father was murdered and the entire empire trembled. Knox had never lost his composure. Never. Until this morning. Perry looked around the room, at the wreckage, then back at Knox. She's gone. Knox didn't lift his head. I know. She's just an adopted girl, Knox, Perry said. Not because he believed it, but because he needed Knox to answer. Your mother took her in less than 4 months ago. She isn't blood. She isn't family by any definition the law recognizes. Why are you reacting like this? Knox lifted his head. His eyes were red, but dry, tired down to the bone. Because I promised my mother. Perry looked at him, said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke, very softly. So soft it was almost nothing at all. Just because you promised your mother. Knox looked at Perry. Perry looked back. Neither of them said anything else. The question hung in the air like a thin thread both of them could see, but neither dared to touch. Knox didn't answer. He never would. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because it belonged somewhere deep inside him that 7 years of building walls still hadn't managed to bury. He turned to the desk, powered on the computer, checked the cameras, find when she left, which way she went. Perry sat down and pulled up the security system. 15 minutes later, he found it. Kitchen door. 3:07 in the morning. Right during the shift change, she went through the west courtyard, slipped through the gap in the fence at the corner of the garden. Perry paused, and there was something almost like admiration in his voice. She used the very procedures I taught her to avoid all of us. Cameras, patrols, shift change. She remembered everything. Knox stared at the screen. The footage showed a blurred figure from a wide-angle camera, a small shape slipping through the gap in the fence in the darkness, a backpack on her shoulders, never once looking back. That's why she'll be hard to find, Knox said, standing up, pulling his chair back, reaching for his jacket. Get the list of places she stayed. From the initial investigation, every place she spent a night in Chicago. Perry opened the old file. I have 11 addresses. Then we go to 11 places. Wren didn't answer right away. She sat in the corner of the warehouse, her back against the cold concrete wall, looking at Knox standing in front of her, and she thought about the 11 places, 11 addresses, 11 places where she had once spent the night during 4 years of drifting through Chicago, from park benches in Grant Park to beneath an overpass in Pilsen, from the overcrowded shelter on Madison Street to the damp, rented room in Humboldt Park that she had managed to keep for 2 months before being thrown out for not having enough money. 11 places. And Knox had gone through all 11 of them to find her. She wondered what he had seen in those places. The benches where she had once curled herself tight, the corners where she had hidden, the fragments of a life she had scattered all over the city and never wanted anyone to see. Knox Aldridge, the boss of Chicago, had driven 4 hours through every broken piece of her life to find her in the last one. Because I heard Perry talking, Wren finally said, her voice rough. Not from crying, but from cold, and from not having spoken to anyone for hours. I'm the weakness. Thatcher is coming after me because of you. Because for the first time you care about someone and they're using that against you. I heard all of it. Every word. Knox didn't answer. He looked at her for another moment. Then he did something Wren didn't expect. He sat down, right there on the filthy cold concrete floor beside her, his back against the same wall. His $4,000 suit touched the dusty warehouse floor. He didn't care. Silence stretched between them. Not the frightening kind of silence Knox used in conference rooms. The silence of two people sitting beside each other in the dark, too tired to pretend, too real to lie. Are you angry? Wren asked, her eyes fixed straight ahead, not on Knox. Angry. Then why are you here? Knox was silent, long enough that Wren thought he might not answer. Then he said, his voice low, thinner than she had ever heard it before, because I don't know how to be anywhere else. Wren turned to look at him. Knox didn't look back. He was staring into the dark stretch of the warehouse, and his eyes weren't cold, weren't flat, only tired. Tired in the way of a man who had held everything together for 7 years, and tonight had nearly let it all fall from his hands. She didn't fully understand what he had just said, or maybe she did understand, and she was afraid to understand, because if she understood correctly, everything would change in a way she wasn't ready for. So she let the words drift past her, keeping them somewhere inside her chest, unopened, unnamed. What is family? Wren said, her voice smaller now, almost a whisper. I mean that. I've never really had one. My mother, she was the only family I had, and then she died. After that, I thought the shelter was home, and then I got thrown out. I thought the rented room was home, and then I ran out of money. I thought the restaurant was something I could lean on, and then I got fired." She stopped. "Then I met Mother Genevieve, met you, met Ruth, and I thought, maybe this time it's different. Maybe this time it's real." Her voice broke very slightly on the last word. "But every time I think I have something, it gets taken away. So I take it away first. At least it hurts less when I'm the one who chooses to leave." Knox sat there and listened to every word. Then he said, "Then don't let anyone take it, not even yourself." Wren looked at him, her eyes wider in the dark. "Listen to me," Knox said, turning to look at her for the first time since sitting down. "You're so afraid of having something taken from you that you take it away first. But have you ever thought that when you leave, you're taking something away from other people too? My mother was trembling this morning when she read your letter," Ruth cried in the kitchen. "And He stopped. "I flipped my desk over in my study, first time in 7 years. Because of one girl who left without saying a word." Wren looked down at her hands. The calloused hands, the thin scar, resting on her knees. "I'm a burden," she said, as though it were the most obvious truth of her life, as though she had been saying it to herself every day for 4 years. Knox looked at her. "Your family." His voice wasn't loud, wasn't forceful, only certain in the way Knox Aldridge said everything, with no room left for doubt. "Those are two different things." Wren opened her mouth and then closed it, opened it again and closed it once more. She wanted to argue, wanted to say that she wasn't worthy, wanted to say that family was something she was never supposed to have. But she looked into Knox's eyes and saw there the thing he had hidden behind his wall of silence for 7 years. And she understood that he wasn't only saying it for her, he was saying it for himself. He was admitting something he himself was still learning how to accept. Knox stood up, brushed the dust from his suit, though the dust had settled too deep to be brushed away entirely. Then he held out his hand to Wren. "Come home." 2 words. Not an order, not a request. Just 2 words, spoken in the voice of a man opening a door and waiting to see whether the other person would step through it. Wren looked at his hand, a large hand, clean, nails neatly trimmed, skin soft from never having to wash dishes or scrub floors, completely different from her own calloused hands. But that hand was reaching for her, waiting for her, and it wasn't trembling. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she reached out and took it. Knox's hand closed lightly around hers, warm, steady, enough to let her know he wasn't going to let go. He pulled her to her feet, and they walked out of the warehouse into the early Chicago morning. The first light just beginning to rise, the air cold but clean, and Perry's black car waiting outside with the engine already running. Wren climbed into the back seat. Knox got in beside her. He didn't say anything. Perry drove without asking a single question. On the way back to the estate, Wren looked out through the window. Chicago was waking up. Streetlights were fading out. Early sunlight was spreading across Lake Michigan. She didn't say anything, but her hand remained in Knox's, and he still didn't let go. 2 days after Knox brought Wren back from the warehouse, Genevieve summoned the entire household to the breakfast room. She sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her eyes bright, her voice allowing no argument. "I'm going to adopt Wren officially, legally, with papers, with lawyers. No one is taking this girl out of this house ever again, not even the girl herself." She looked at Wren. "Not even you." Wren opened her mouth, but didn't have time to speak. Knox, seated across from her, gave a single nod. No argument, no question, just a nod. And that nod said more than any words he could have spoken. Knox called Tate Mercer that same afternoon. The appointment was set for Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning at the lawyer's office in the Loop. Knox assigned a full security convoy, 2 black cars, 4 men, Perry in the lead car, Genevieve and Wren in the second. The route was checked twice in advance. Dash cameras were left running the entire time. Everything was prepared with the same thoroughness Knox used for everything else, leaving no opening. But Knox didn't know the opening wasn't in the route or the convoy. It was inside. One of the estate's own security men, a man Thatcher had bought 3 weeks earlier, sent the exact schedule to Thatcher the night before. Departure time, route, number of cars, number of people, everything. Thursday morning, the convoy left the estate at exactly 9:30. Genevieve sat in the back seat on the left, Wren on the right. Genevieve took Wren's hand and squeezed gently. "After today, you'll be Wren Aldridge. Do you hear me?" Wren looked at her, nodded, and for the first time smiled without hiding it. A small smile, only there for a moment, but real. The convoy had been on the road for 15 minutes and was turning into a quiet stretch of West Randolph Street when everything happened in 3 seconds. In the first second, a loud explosion sounded ahead. The lead car swerved. Its front right tire blew out, and the car shot toward the curb and slammed into the divider. In the second second, the back window of Genevieve's car shattered, not from the explosion, from something that came straight through the glass, sending shards across the cabin like crystal rain. Genevieve leaned away, and a piece of glass sliced across her forehead, a small, shallow wound, just enough to throw her sideways. In the third second, Wren moved. She didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh options. 4 years on the street had taught her something no school ever could: reflex. When danger came, her body acted before her mind could catch up. She threw herself to the left, covering Genevieve with her own body, using her back and shoulder to shield her from the glass still falling. One large shard scraped along Wren's right shoulder, cutting through her shirt, but she didn't feel the pain. She only felt Genevieve's body trembling beneath her, and she held tighter. "Mom, are you okay?" Wren said it in a voice strangely calm, the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has lived too long inside chaos. "I'm okay," Genevieve whispered, her hand gripping Wren's arm. "You're hurt." "I'm fine." Outside the car there were shouts, engines, running footsteps. Perry had gotten out of the lead car and was shouting into his radio. The guards from the rear car moved into position, forming a barrier around Genevieve's vehicle. Wren remembered. In the middle of the noise and chaos, she remembered what Perry had taught her. Emergency procedure. Step 1, call Perry. Step 2, report the location. Step 3, do not leave the car. She pulled the phone from Genevieve's coat pocket, Perry's number already saved on speed dial. She pressed call. "Perry, Mrs. Aldridge's car. Rear window shattered. She has a light forehead injury. I'm okay. We're still inside the car. We need backup now." Her voice was steady, clear, brief. Perry would later tell Knox that she had made that call like someone trained for 10 years, not 4 weeks. Backup arrived in 9 minutes. For those 9 minutes, Wren lay over Genevieve's body, her right shoulder soaked, glass still caught in the fabric of her shirt, and she didn't move. She only held Genevieve tightly and whispered the words the older woman would remember for the rest of her life. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You're okay. I'm here." The attackers pulled back when they heard the sound of incoming backup. Fast, clean, gone into Chicago traffic as if they had never existed. Thatcher never left a trace. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Back at the estate, Knox got Perry's call at 10:17. He was sitting in his study, coffee in hand, reading the third quarter financial report. Perry spoke 2 sentences. Knox set down the coffee cup. Slowly, he placed it on the desk without spilling a single drop. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, straightened his cuffs. "Call everyone." His voice was flat as the surface of a table. No rise, no fall, no trembling, no anger, just flat. And that was the most frightening thing anyone working for Knox Aldridge had ever heard. Because when Knox was angry, he flipped desks. When he was this calm, someone was about to lose everything. "Anyone who lays a hand on my mother is beyond negotiation." He walked out of the room, and the house seemed to tremble, not from the sound of his footsteps, but because everyone in the estate understood that Aldridge had just shifted from defense to attack. And when Knox Aldridge attacked, he didn't stop until the other side could no longer stand. Knox didn't hurry. That was how Perry knew this time was different from all the others. When Knox was angry, he acted fast. When he became this calm, he was thinking farther ahead, thinking deeper, and the result would hurt many times more than any immediate reaction ever could. On the afternoon of the attack, Knox sat in his study with Perry and Tate Mercer. On the desk were 3 thick files that Tate had been quietly building for the past 4 months, ever since the first time Knox spoke Thatcher's name aloud. 4 months of collecting, money laundering transactions through 6 shell companies, fake real estate contracts, undisclosed interstate fund transfers, federal tax evasion, more than enough evidence to make sure Thatcher wouldn't see sunlight for a very long time. "I can file this with the FBI tomorrow morning," Tate said. They'll open a formal investigation within 48 hours. Knox nodded. File it tonight. Perry looked at him. Are you sure? Bringing in the FBI means you won't control the outcome. I don't need control. I need him alive in a cage. Knox stood and buttoned his jacket. If he disappears, he becomes a martyr in the eyes of his men. If he sits in a federal courtroom, stripped layer by layer in front of the whole world, losing his money, his power, his name, losing everything, then he becomes a lesson. And lessons live longer than anything I could ever do with my own hands. Tate nodded, gathered the files, and left. Perry stayed another minute. The mole in the security team. I identified him. Marcus Webb. Thatcher's been paying him for 3 weeks. Envelope and one-way ticket? Already prepared. Handle it before tonight. I don't want to see his face when I come home. Perry nodded and walked out. Knox stood alone in the study. He looked down at the desk, where the cup of coffee from that morning was still sitting, gone cold. He picked it up, and for the first time realized that his hand was still trembling slightly. Since that morning, since the moment Perry called with the news, it had been shaking the entire time, without stopping. He set the cup down, clenched his hand, opened it, clenched it again. The trembling still wouldn't stop. He drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 6 o'clock that evening. Genevieve had already been examined and sent home 2 hours earlier. The cut on her forehead only a surface wound, not deep enough to need stitches. But Wren was still there. The shard of glass lodged in her right shoulder had needed to be removed and treated, and the cut, nearly 4 inches long, wasn't deep, but it was enough for the doctor to insist she stay overnight for observation. Knox stepped into the hospital room. Wren was sitting on the bed, her right shoulder wrapped in white bandages, her left hand holding a paper cup of water. She wore a loose hospital gown, her hair hanging down, her face paler than usual. But her eyes were still clear, still sharp, still able to read the person in front of her faster than almost anyone else. Knox stood in the doorway, looking at her, looking longer than he should have, looking at the white bandage around her shoulder, at the small wrist emerging from the hospital sleeve, at the way her eyes met his without blinking. He had looked at Wren many times over the past 4 months, looked at her eating in the dark kitchen, looked at her asleep with her head on the table, looked at her calloused hands, looked at her folding aprons, folding handkerchiefs, folding everything into neat order. But he had never looked at her like this. Never looked at someone who had thrown her own body over his mother. Never looked at a girl of 21, barely 103 pounds, so thin the wind looked as though it could carry her off, who had thrown herself into shattered glass to protect the woman she called mother. Knox walked into the room. Wren set the cup of water down. "Mother's okay now," she said first, as if that were the only thing that mattered. The cut on her forehead wasn't deep. "She's already home." Knox didn't answer. He walked to the side of the bed. Wren looked up at him, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to scold her for leaving the house without permission, for disobeying him, for risking herself, waiting for anything except what he actually did. Knox sat down on the edge of the bed, then he leaned forward, wrapped both arms around Wren, carefully avoiding her injured right shoulder, and held her. Wren went rigid. Her whole body froze inside his arms. 4 years of survival instinct making her not know what to do when someone held her without meaning harm. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had embraced her. Maybe her mother Lillian, in that hospital room, before she closed her eyes, 4 years ago. Knox held her, and his hands were trembling hard enough that Wren could feel it through the thin hospital gown. This was Knox Aldridge, the man all of Chicago was afraid to look at directly, holding her with shaking hands, his face buried in her hair, and not letting go. "You're shaking," Wren said softly. "No," Knox's voice was muffled in her hair. "You are shaking." Knox didn't answer. He only held her tighter, more carefully, and Wren felt his breath hot against her neck, quick and uneven, the breathing of a man trying to hold on to something he had almost lost. Slowly, Wren softened inside his arms. She lowered her left shoulder, rested her forehead against Knox's, and closed her eyes. They sat there for who knew how long, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, because sometimes silence between two people says more than any words ever could, and the trembling hands of a crime boss holding a girl in a hospital room said more than any confession he would never allow himself to speak. Thatcher was arrested by the FBI on Monday morning, 3 days after the attack. He was sitting in his private office on the 23rd floor of the building he owned on Michigan Avenue when 7 federal agents entered at the same time. He didn't run. He didn't call a lawyer. He only sat there and watched them put him in handcuffs. And as they led him through the lobby in front of his employees and business partners, he understood that Knox Aldridge didn't need to lay a hand on him. Knox only needed to open the door for the right people to walk through, and let the system do the rest. Clean. Legal. Not a single drop on his hands. That was how a real boss dealt with an enemy. 2 weeks later, when everything had settled down, Genevieve invited Tate Mercer to the estate. Not to the office. To the house. She wanted to sign the adoption papers right there at the dining table where the family sat every evening, because this was family business, not legal business. Tate brought a thick packet of 20 pages. Official adoption documents under Illinois law. Wren Casey, 21 years old, would become Wren Aldridge. She would carry the Aldridge name. She would be protected by every legal right that name carried with it. Genevieve signed first. Her hand didn't tremble this time. She signed in a clear, strong hand, the signature of someone who had waited for this moment longer than anyone else knew. Then she pushed the documents toward Wren. Wren took the pen. She looked at the line that read name after adoption, Wren Aldridge, and she stopped. The pen touched the paper, but she didn't write. She looked up, looked at Genevieve, looked at Knox standing in the dining room doorway, looked at Ruth pretending to wipe down the kitchen table when in truth she was watching her, looked at Perry leaning against the wall in the hallway. Sign, Genevieve said softly. No one can take it back now. Wren signed. Her handwriting was small and slanted, not beautiful, but clear. Wren Aldridge. She wrote the new surname, and her hand trembled on the last letter, but she finished it. It was done. Tate gathered the papers, shook Genevieve's hand, nodded to Knox, and left. When the front door closed behind him, Genevieve embraced Wren, held her tightly, for a long time, in the kind of embrace she hadn't given anyone in 27 years. The kind of embrace meant only for a daughter. That afternoon, Knox knocked on Wren's door. Come in. Wren was sitting on the bed reading, one knee drawn up. Knox stepped inside, one hand holding something small, metallic. He stood in the middle of the room and let his eyes travel over it once. This room, 27 years earlier, had belonged to Elise. After Elise died, Genevieve had kept everything unchanged for years. The crib, the teddy bear, the pale pink curtains. Then slowly, year after year, she changed things one piece at a time, put the old belongings away, repainted the walls, changed the curtains, until the room was no longer a child's room, but an empty guest room. And a month earlier, Knox had quietly had the whole room redone. A new bed, a new desk, bookshelves, a reading lamp. He hadn't asked anyone, hadn't told anyone. He had simply done it. Knox opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a small silver key, newly cut. Your room key. Wren looked at the key. This room already had a key before. The old one was a household spare. This one is yours alone. No one has a copy. Not even me. Wren set her book down and sat up straighter. She looked at the key in Knox's hand, then at him. This room is yours, Knox said. Not a guest room. Not temporary. Not borrowed. You try and see. You renovated your sister's room for me? Wren's voice was quiet, not accusing, only asking a question she needed answered. Knox looked at her. No. I renovated your room. Elise's room is gone. From now on, this is your room. Wren reached out and took the key. Her fingers brushed his palm as she picked it up. Only lightly, only for a second, and both of them pretended not to notice. Wren closed her hand around the key, the cold metal warming slowly inside her calloused palm. Knox gave a single nod, stepped out, closed the door behind him. His footsteps faded down the hallway. Wren sat on the bed with the key in her hand, and she cried. Cried silently, without sound, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She cried not because she was sad. She cried because for the first time in her life, she had a room whose key belonged only to her. No one could come in unless she allowed it. No one could throw her out because it was hers. Hers. She sat there for a long time. Then she wiped her eyes, slid off the bed, and knelt on the floor. She looked under the bed. The torn backpack was still there, in the exact place where she had shoved it on the first day. The backpack she had carried through 4 years on the street. The backpack she had packed on that first night after hearing the maids speak badly about her. The backpack she had slung over her shoulder when she left at 3 o'clock in the morning. The backpack Knox had found beside her in the warehouse on the south side. She pulled it out. It was almost weightless. There was nothing left inside. She held it in both hands, looking at the faded, frayed fabric, at the straps with one side torn through, at the zipper that stuck. She looked at it the way someone looks at an old friend she is about to say goodbye to. Then she stood, walked into the hallway, and dropped the backpack into the trash. Ruth happened to pass by. She stopped, looked at the crumpled, torn backpack lying in the trash bin, then looked at Ren, throwing it away. Ren looked at the backpack one last time. "I don't need running things anymore." Ruth stood there. She wanted to say something. Wanted to tell her she was proud. Wanted to tell her she had known for a long time. From that first night when she sat on the floor of Ren's room and said Mrs. Genevieve had never sat in the rain with anyone. Wanted to say so much, but she didn't. She only turned away and walked quickly toward the kitchen. And for the first time in 30 years of serving the Aldridge family, Ruth Brennan cried. Not because she was sad, not because she was tired, not because of loss. She cried because she was happy, because a 21-year-old girl had just thrown the only backpack she had into the trash, and that was how she said she believed. Believed that she belonged here. Believed that she would never have to run again. Believed that this time for real, she was allowed to stay. 3 years after the day Ren Aldridge dropped her torn backpack into the trash, she stood on the stage of DePaul University's auditorium in her graduation gown, holding her degree in social work, and looked down at the audience. That morning, before leaving the estate, Ren knocked on the door of Knox's study. "Graduation is at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Knox didn't lift his eyes from the screen. "I'm busy." "You're always busy." "That's right." Ren stood in the doorway for another second, then smiled and turned away. She didn't plead. Never. After 4 years in the Aldridge house, she had learned that when Knox said, "I'm busy," it didn't mean he was busy. It meant he still didn't know how to say, "I'll be there," without feeling as though he was opening himself too much. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The DePaul auditorium was full. Genevieve sat in the third row, her back straight, her eyes shining, with Ruth beside her clutching a handkerchief because she already knew she would cry before the ceremony was over. Perry stood along the left aisle, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, scanning the room out of habit even though this was only a graduation and not an underground deal. And in the very last row, on the right side, where the light didn't reach, Knox Aldridge sat alone. He had arrived earlier than everyone else, before the auditorium staff had even opened the doors. He sat in the last row because Knox never sat close. He came because he didn't know how not to come, and he sat there, in the dark, because that was where he always chose to be when he wanted to watch someone without being watched in return. Ren had been chosen to give the address on behalf of the graduating social work students. She stepped to the podium, degree in hand, and looked out over the packed hall. She drew in one breath. 4 years ago, I was sitting in the rain outside a hospital in Chicago, burning with 104-degree fever. No money, no insurance, no one. I was sitting there thinking maybe that night would be my last, not because of the illness, but because I no longer had any reason to wait for morning. She paused. The hall fell silent. Then a woman sat down beside me, in the middle of the rain. No umbrella, no coat. She didn't give me money. She didn't call an ambulance. She asked me one question. "Who taught you to fold an apron?" Ren looked down toward the third row, where Genevieve was crying without even trying to wipe her tears away. That question saved my life, not because the question itself was important, but because it was the first time someone asked who I was instead of asking what I needed, and that difference changed everything. She looked across the rows again, her eyes searching the seats in front, then farther, farther still, until she found the familiar shape in the very last row on the right side, where the light didn't reach. She smiled. "And my brother." Her voice changed, softer now, warmer. "The coldest man I have ever met. The man who never says, 'I love you' or 'I worry about you,' or any sentence longer than 5 words. A ripple of laughter moved through the hall. "But he taught me that family doesn't have to say love every day. Family is the person who, at 3 o'clock in the morning, drives across the whole city, through 11 different places, looking for you when you run away. And then, when he finds you, he doesn't say one word of blame. He just sits down beside you on a freezing concrete floor and asks, 'Why did you leave?'" Perry, still standing by the left aisle, tilted his head toward the last row. Then he said, just loudly enough for Knox to hear, "You're crying." Knox, eyes red, jaw tight, answered without turning his head, "I'm not crying." Ren, up on stage with the microphone still on, looked straight toward the last row. "You're crying." The whole auditorium laughed. Genevieve laughed through her tears. Ruth gave up trying to hide her crying. And Knox Aldridge, the coldest boss in Chicago, sat in the last row with the corner of his mouth twitching into the smallest half-smile, a half-smile only Ren could see from the stage. After the ceremony, Ren ran down to find Knox. The last row was empty. He had already gone. But on the seat, exactly where he had been sitting, there was a brown envelope. No name, no letter, no note. Ren opened it. Inside was a stack of documents. Incorporation papers for a foundation supporting homeless women in Chicago. The name of the foundation, Lillian Casey Foundation. It had already been funded. The legal process had already been completed. It was ready to begin operating. Signed by Knox Aldridge. Ren looked at the name Lillian Casey on the documents, and she remembered. She remembered one morning 4 years earlier, when Perry had told her that Knox had once asked him, what was her mother's name? Lillian Casey. He had asked once, never asked again, never brought it up again. But he remembered for 4 full years, and he had placed that name on something that would outlive both of them. Ren pulled out her phone and called Knox. He answered on the second ring. "You didn't have to do this." "I know. Then why did you?" Silence. Long silence. Then Knox's voice came through, softer than she had ever heard it, thinner, closer, as if he were saying something he said to no one else. "Because you deserve to have something bearing your mother's name, to honor the strength of your roots. And so you'll know that where you came from isn't something to be ashamed of. It's beautiful, because it made you," Ren cried. Standing in the nearly empty auditorium, holding the papers that carried her mother's name, she cried. Knox heard her crying through the phone. He didn't say, "Don't cry." He didn't say, "It's okay." He only stayed there on the other end, listening, until her sobs softened into quiet breathing. "Knox, what?" "Thank you. For everything. For all of it. Don't thank me. Come home." "Which home?" Silence. One beat. Then Knox spoke, and there was something in his voice Ren had never heard before. Warmth. "Our home." Then he hung up, because Knox Aldridge never said too much. Ren looked at the dark phone screen. She stood there in the empty auditorium, with the Chicago afternoon sunlight pouring through the glass doors, and she smiled. Smiled through tears. Smiled because the coldest boss in the city had just said "our home" in the warmest voice she had ever heard from him, and she didn't know what our home meant. Whether it meant the home of brother and sister, or the home of something else. Something both of them felt, but neither was brave enough to name, and maybe it didn't need a name. Some things are most beautiful when they remain undefined. Some bonds don't need definitions to be stronger than any contract ever written, and some stories are at their best, not at the final period, but in the space that comes after it, where the listener writes the rest of the ending for themselves. If this story touched you, please press the like button and share this video so more people can hear it. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can listen to new stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about Knox and Ren, about this story. So please leave a comment and share what you felt from deep in your heart. Every comment you leave is encouragement for us to keep telling stories that reach emotion. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and calm. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.